Psychiatric disorders are pretty ubiquitous. According to the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, about 4% of the overall population suffers from a psychiatric disorder. And this number is pretty stable whether we break the population down according to gender, age group, or ethnicity. Where do we draw the line between health and disorder? Do we draw it here and say that anyone who experiences any form of anxiety has a disorder? Or do we draw it here and say that only those individuals experiencing the most intense form of these traits have a disorder? Or is the distinction a bit more nuanced? The definition states that these symptoms that we observe must reflect a dysfunction in processes underlying mental function. But how do we measure this? I mean, that's kind of a problematic issue. And although there are agreed upon metrics by which to measure this dysfunction, they are, again, based on symptomatic presentation. And so ultimately, I think there is some degree of subjectivity involved in making a psychiatric diagnosis. And so each neuron contains this long process called an axon, which it uses to communicate with other neurons. The axon releases chemicals called neurotransmitters, shown here as red diamonds. And these neurotransmitters cross the space between the two cells, which is called the synapse, and go on to interact with the downstream cell to either stimulate or suppress its activity. So normally, serotonin is released into the synapse, it has a chance to act on the downstream cell, and it's then actually taken back up into the cell that released it by traveling through a protein on the surface of that neuron called the serotonin transporter. What happens when you take an antidepressant drug is that the drug binds to this serotonin transporter, blocking it, so that now serotonin can't be taken back up, but rather remains in the synapse and has a prolonged opportunity to interact with the downstream cell. So what we've seen then is that antidepressant drugs increase the amount of serotonin outside the cells in the brain, and at the same time as they decrease depressive symptoms. And so it turns out that the serotonin transporter is encoded by a gene that has two forms. There's a short form shown here in orange and a long form shown in blue. Individuals carrying the short form of the serotonin transporter gene had a very high probability of having a depressive episode as the amount of stress in their lives increased. Whereas individuals carrying the long form of the serotonin transporter gene had a much lower, a significantly lower probability of having a major depressive episode, even with increased stress, you can see. But the fact is that serotonin can't be the whole picture, and there are a couple of reasons for this. So first of all, antidepressant drugs work for some people, but not for everyone. And even for those individuals for which they do work, they reduce symptoms, but they tend not to eliminate them, so it's not a cure. And so these facts suggest that serotonin just can't be the whole picture. So the reality of the situation is that there seem to be shared symptoms across psychiatric disorders and shared genetic components. And so perhaps these disorders are more similar than we had at first thought. And maybe a symptom-based system for diagnosing psychiatric disorders just isn't the best approach. The NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, have launched a program called RDoC, or Research Domain Criteria. And the goal of RDoC is basically to help establish a biological basis for psychiatric diagnosis. And the way that it works is as follows. It breaks symptoms down not into psychiatric disorders, but into basic psychological traits. We study the biology underlying anxiety at the behavioral level, at the neurological level, at the level of circuits, down to the cell and the molecules they secrete, and even down to the genes. So by asking questions that probe the biology of different psychological traits and not disorders at each of these levels, the goal is that we may be able to gather a wide enough range of information that we can develop a biologically based diagnostic system.